Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about the beginning of the animal rights movement here in the United States that really dates back to the Civil War era that was sparked by a 53-year-old man who was a failed writer. His name was Henry Bergh. It is a movement that has been influenced by the slavery abolitionist movement and one that also corresponds in time for calls for better treatment of women and children. It's a story also of how industrialization and the creation of machines have changed our relationship to animals. For this conversation, I'm very happy to welcome to this program Ernest Freeberg. Ernest Freeberg is a distinguished professor of humanities at the University of Tennessee, and he is the author of the book, A Traitor to His Species, Henry Bergh and the Birth of the Animal Rights Movement. Ernest Freeberg, it is my very good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Thank you very much, Mitch. It's good to be here.
It's good to have you. Your book really made me think about our relationship to animals and how that relationship, speaking in over a last couple of hundred years, how that relationship has changed, especially in cities. Today in cities, maybe you have pets, some rats, some birds, but not a lot more than that. 160 years ago or so, though, cities were full of animals, weren't they?
Absolutely. And I was drawn to that because I've spent a lot of time researching this time period, and you see images of streets, especially crowded streets, boulevards, and there's always a traffic jam of horses, of carriages and hacks and solo horses. Beyond that, what you don't always see in those images is the garbage that's being picked up by the pigs in the gutters, sort of wandering stray, the large numbers of stray dogs, packs of uncontrolled dogs in the streets. And this is a time when a lot of people are moving from the country into the city, and they're bringing with them their milk cows and their flocks of geese and chickens. So all of these things are sort of roiling about in the city in the Gilded Age, right at a time when the city itself is expanding enormously, and becoming more industrial, more mechanical. So you really get a collision between modern mechanized America and the sort of rural or traditional America. And frankly, cities have run on animal power all through human history. And that's, as you suggest, that starts to change in this time period.
Yeah. Tell me more about how reliant cities were on animals.
Well, of course, the horse is the one thing that everybody would start with, and that is because they provide absolutely essential energy for every aspect of the city. I think we associate this period with the steam engine, with the development of the locomotive as a sort of transformative technology. But even the locomotive doesn't work without horses. You have to have horses to bring coal and wood and fuel and passengers to the train. You have to have them to take things away from the depot. You even have to move trains around in the yard with teams of horses. So they're absolutely fundamental to even to that transportation that we think is eclipsing the horse. And they are everywhere you see a cab and a Prius now, there was a horse. So they were everywhere with much fewer traffic directions. So there was a lot of chaos in the streets. A lot of, people were engaged in these powerful, smart beasts face to face on a daily basis. So absolutely, that's essential. The other piece of this is that before refrigeration, meat eaters relied on the animals that were brought right into the city. There were big stockyards right on the central Manhattan, any other major city, where butchers would then take them and bring them to their own butcher shops and butcher them right there. So the animals, the livestock was in the streets all the time.
And it's interesting because it also presents a huge public hygiene challenge, doesn't it?
Sure. Well, mountains of manure that have to be dealt with constantly. And the slaughter is also another area where there really wasn't sufficient sanitation. All of this stuff has to get worked out in this time period. And so it's a lot of the health reformers of the period trying to stop rampant diseases. There were plenty of pandemics in the day. that were caused by this bad sanitation. And some of that was traced back to the slaughterhouses and the refuse that was either left in the gutters or dumped into the water supply, or they would haul it out and dump it in the bay somewhere and it would wash back in. So, the ability to cope with all of the animal matter and to live side by side with animals really became one of the major challenges that people trying to figure out how the modern city works, they had to cope with where do animals fit into this.
Before we get into Henry Bergh and his life, let's talk about sort of the second half of the 19th century. Really interesting time. Obviously, you have the Civil War during this period of time. You have industrialization happening during this period of time. We have this changing nature to animals, as you've already laid out, especially in the cities during this time. But we're also having, along with the birth of animal rights movements, you're also having a real time of a push for also women rights of children. Do you think this is all happening because of industrialization? Is this all happening at the same time?
Yeah, that's a complicated thing. I think in some ways the urban environment made these problems much more visible to people. You get a lot of people with a lot of eyes on each other. I think there's that. I think the long fight and ultimate success of the anti-slavery movement was a rallying cry for those who were reformers, who felt like, yes, it is possible to create transformative change and deal with a social evil. So a lot of the movements you're talking about after the Civil War are really clearly inspired by the abolitionist movement and using a lot of the same techniques, and the argument that we need to protect those who are dependent and who are suffering. So that applied to the argument about the enslaved people, and it also applies to needing to take a fresh look at the protecting women and children and animals, all happening around the same time.
Yeah. Henry Bergh, this is an interesting character. He would start the ASPCA in the 1860s. But at the time when he started it, he was 53 years old. So sort of late in life. I imagine even later, considering that we're talking in the second half of the 19th century at this time. Up to that point, he was mostly known as a failed writer?
Yeah. Well, he inherited a fortune from his father, who was a very successful shipbuilder in Manhattan. And Henry Bergh wasn't interested in the shipbuilding business. He went to law school at Columbia for a little while and quickly spent a couple of years there, and then just decided to take his fortune, marry another wealthy socialite, and they went off to Europe and basically spent most of his career wandering the capitals of Europe. And he wrote apparently very bad plays and sort of maudlin poetry, and tried to break into the theater, but really had no great success. And many people who reflected on it said, he just never realized just how bad he was as a writer. But he kept trying. So it really wasn't until he was 53 years old, as you're saying, he was assigned to work in the Russian embassy by Lincoln during the Civil War, drawing on the fact that Bergh was a guy who knew Europe. He was a sophisticated guy, and he could represent the United States in that environment. Bergh didn't like St. Petersburg very much. And one thing that really provoked him was the Teamsters, who were apparently whipping their horses even more in the streets of St. Petersburg than they did back in his home city of New York. So as he tells it, over the years, he finally snapped one day. He ordered a Teamster to drop his whip, and the man did. And Bergh has this epiphany that, wow, that's the most useful thing I've ever done with my life. I want more of that. And so he decides, as he explains it, that this is what he's going to do with the rest of his life. He left the embassy very quickly, went to England, where the Royal SPCA had been founded in the 1820s by anti-slavery people. And then this brought this idea back to the United States in 1866 and gets it launched as the ASPCA in New York. People called him the riddle of the 19th century because not only did he come to this late, but even after he did, there was really no evidence that he was doing this because he loved animals. He's often remembered as the great animal lover of the 19th century. He didn't have pets. That wasn't really his motivation. It was really a hatred of cruelty rather than a sort of sentimental interest in animals as such that motivated him.
That seems important to me, and that actually was kind of my next question: is did he have this lifelong love affair for animals? And
yeah, no, he didn't, and he was not afraid to say so. He clearly cared about animals. He came to care about them. He devoted the next 20 years of his life to inserting himself between some pretty bad people, rescuing them from horrendous situations. I mean, we shouldn't minimize what he accomplished and the passion that was behind that work, but it wasn't motivated by what we would think of as a lifelong devotion to other species.
And he wasn't a vegetarian. He wasn't against other people eating meat. Wasn't a vegan, though. I don't know if they had
Right.
that term back then.
No, they did not.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's really fascinating. What he said was this. I mean, it's interesting because, we think now of animal rights as something which is much more expansive than what Bergh thought about. Bergh said, there's one thing that all creatures have a right to, and that is to not have to suffer unnecessary cruelty. That doesn't mean we can't use animals, but we have to use them in a way that is respectful of them and minimizes the suffering. So if we're going to slaughter, and eat a hamburger, we need to figure out how to do it in a way that's doesn't do unnecessary suffering and violence to the animals. Bergh himself, he spent a lot of time in slaughterhouses and saw some pretty horrendous things. He was there way before Upton Sinclair was in the jungle, and he was exposing the practices of slaughterhouses that he was seeing and the transportation of livestock. So he had lots of reasons to be a vegetarian, but he said no, he couldn't quite do it. He felt like civilization as it evolves will eventually become vegetarian down the road. And he was also very aware that he was already controversial enough for defending animals, and that if he tried to push vegetarianism, that would be totally beyond the pale for the people he was trying to win support from.
And probably for that time.
Yeah, I mean, there were vegetarians. There was the sort of health movement going on with John Harvey Kellogg and Battle Creek, Michigan, and so there was a vegetarian movement, but not part of Bergh's world.
I mean, I just keep thinking about the distinction you made. He seemed to be more concerned about human cruelty than the animal itself. I got the sense he wasn't talking about wild animals. He wasn't talking about the preservation of land for wild animals. He was really talking about the animals that, I guess, one way or the other, served humans.
Well, that's a really important point. I came to the conclusion that first of all, it was very, very, environmental thinking, the kind of even knowledge of what was going on outside the city limits was something we take for granted. We are bombarded with information about ecosystems around the world and the status of species. In most cases, that was really not something that was even measurable or accessible for people like Henry Bergh. And the cruelty was so clearly focused in the urban environment, the sort of reform impulse and financial support for that kind of thing was focused in cities. So it really was, and I suppose continues to be, predominantly an urban and suburban movement, the SPCA. They did, Bergh got contacted, for example, by people on the Western Plains who were watching the decimation of the American bison. They wrote to him and said, look, you're the most visible supporter of animals in the country. Help, and Bergh clearly sympathized with this. And he lobbied Congress to try to pass laws to regulate the slaughter of the bison that were not successful, vetoed by President Grant. So he was aware of those issues. He was sympathetic, but there was so much work to be done right in front of them in the urban environment that I think that's really where their focus was.
So as you mentioned, he starts the SPCA, which stands for Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. This is in 1868. You mentioned he's lobbying for these bills that were vetoed by Grant, which is interesting. He's also very successful actually in getting laws and protecting animals. For being a failed writer, granted, he was a diplomat to Russia, but for being how did he become so influential so quickly?
Well, I think it's partly his class status. He clearly had, he grew up rubbing elbows with the elite of New York City, the Vanderbilts and so forth. He knew these people. I think it's also the case, and he was very articulate. I mean, he was a flamboyant, all his years as a failed playwright served him very well when it came time to giving a speech and promoting the cause. And he was very, very good at winning public sympathy that way. I think it's also the case that when he presented this idea, we ought to have the nation's first anti-cruelty law. Nobody was against, nobody was in favor of cruelty, right? So it was not hard to get the mayor and the police chief and, the wealthy philanthropists to sign on to something which said we need to stop cruelty to animals. The rub came when Bergh pushed that much further than anybody expected. I think most of the people who supported this, including the state legislature of New York that passed it very quickly and gave him a charter, really thought he was just going to focus on poor men beating their horses in the streets, and maybe a few other, there were obvious abuses going on in the streets. Bergh took this much, much further. He wrote into the law horses, livestock, and all other creatures. And that turned out to be an open door for him to protect the rights of turtles being shipped from Key West in cruel fashion to ship to fish markets in New York, to take on P.T. Barnum and his circus, to really push it in ways that I think really anticipated all of the ways that we now think about our responsibility to animals and recognize the sort of moral quandaries that are involved in that. Bergh pushed it. That's what made him so important, but also so controversial at the time.
He also achieved policing powers.
Yeah,
he could arrest people.
Yeah, and that's absolutely crucial. And that's the other really key thing that it was an innovation on his part, was that the law empowered the SPCA movement to appoint its own agents, to hire them. They'd have to raise the money to put them in the field. But these people, including Bergh himself, who wore one of these badges, had a sort of semi-official police power to go out and issue fines or to threaten people with arrest. Sometimes they would call on the police to help with the arrest, especially if it was a big, breaking up a dog fight or something where there's a lot of people to be arrested. And Bergh would himself prosecute these cases in court with no training as a lawyer, but lots of training in the theatrics of the courtroom, and he'd take them to court. And it's another case where, the law was there, but nobody quite knew where the line was. What's the line between, yes, you can whip your horse because it's bulky and it's not moving along in traffic, but what's excessive whipping, right? And yes, you're allowed to slaughter your livestock, but what's doing that in a cruel way? Where's that line? And so these test cases, one after another, had to be brought to court. Bergh lost a lot of them. The judges said, that doesn't sound like cruelty. That's just something we've been doing all the time, So Bergh lost a lot of them, but along the way, the press got interested. And so even when he lost, he got a lot of publicity for the movement. He got a lot of people thinking about these issues and really tracing, our implications, our impact on animals in all sorts of directions that nobody anticipated when they let him have that law in 1866.
I'm assuming that policing power is no longer there.
Well, it's interesting. Historians who've looked at this have suggested that this was really a crucial, it actually has lasted in some places down to today. And it's also a model for other sorts of social service agencies where we grant, social workers a particular authority to enforce, to basically act on behalf of the state, even though they may be part of a nonprofit organization that's rallying around this sort of thing. So actually, it was a really important transition in the reach of the state, and the empowerment of what I guess we would now call special interest groups, to look out for particular groups, including not just animals, but also women and children in this period.
This is Letters on Politics, and we are in conversation with Ernest Freeberg. He's Distinguished Professor of Humanities at the University of Tennessee, and he is the author of the book that we are in conversation about. It's called A Traitor to His Species, Henry Bergh and the Birth of the Animal Rights Movement. The title of your book, and I rarely actually talk about titles of the book. Maybe I should more. I mean, they are significant, but A Traitor to His Species, I originally, before I dived into it, thought, oh, he's taking this after what they used to call FDR, a traitor to his class. But no, they were calling Henry Bergh a traitor to his species even before FDR was born.
Sure. Bergh received a tremendous amount of ridicule for this. Many people said, well, yeah, we get the idea that animal cruelty is bad, but Bergh is going too far. He's eccentric. He's going where he's not asked. He's interfering with traffic when he's trying to stop horse trolleys. He's shutting down the whole economy by protecting the horses that are towing barges on the Erie Canal. He's going after rich people because they happen to like to shoot pigeons for practice, shooting practice. The movement's fine, but Bergh is disgracing it by being eccentric, right? And so Bergh, while many people admired him and said, even if they didn't always agree with some of the ways that he was pushing the conversation, they appreciated that somebody had to be doing that. But others, powerful interests went after him and considered him to be a traitor to his species, somebody who was acting on behalf of animals at the expense of human beings.
He was ridiculed
constantly. Yeah, and he was sensitive. I mean, for a guy who was so courageous, who thrust himself into the middle of dogfights and, was pelted by meat scraps when he went into the slaughterhouses. It hurt him. He described sort of coming back at the end of the day and just, weeping in his pillow and just being totally, especially when he would prosecute a case, he would feel sure that he was in the right and the judge would just dismiss it, or the jury would not prosecute. That frustrated him deeply. But he prevailed. And, by the end of his career, people tended to always say, we admit he was right. He pushed it too far. He's eccentric. There are examples where we don't agree with him, but we have to agree that he moved the conversation in the right direction. And he was admired for that.
Yeah, talk to me a little more about what he moved it from? What was the attitude towards animals?
Well, of course, it depends on the animal, but I think, let's take horses, for example. We talked about how horses are the central power driving the cities and the mass transportation systems, which really made the city possible. I mean, we're talking about cities that are expanding exponentially in this period. And that means they have to get bigger and bigger geographically. And to do that, they need to be connected by these trolley lines that were pulled by teams of horses. Very wealthy capitalists would get the right to run one of these lines as a monopoly, and they'd have a stable of sometimes 1,000, 2,000 horses that they would have to keep running constantly to keep this line going, moving millions of passengers a year. They were not sentimental about those horses, right? I mean, I think we have a vision. I had a vision that, okay, when the horse is done its career, you put it out to pasture, but not at all. These were treated as machines. The stable managers managed to recognize just how much stabling and food and veterinary care they needed to put into an animal in order to get the maximum amount of work out of it in a year or two. And the horse would be broken by the end of it. And they would recycle it to the rendering plant and just process them like machines, right? And along the way, as they were breaking down, they were suffering enormously in the streets of New York and other cities, pulling these made all the worse because of the fact that there were no regulations about how many people could get on these trolleys. So, a trolley that was supposed to hold 35 people might have 75 on it. people climbing on the roof and so forth, and the horses staggering and slipping, many of them breaking their legs and collapsing. So there's absolutely, this is the sort of behavior and treatment of horses extremely utilitarian. Just as machines, when Bergh starts to interfere, their answer is, "This is my property. You can't tell me what to do with my property." And Bergh would say, "Well, it's property that now has rights. It's yes, still your property, but property where there are limits to what you can do with your property."
That sounds significant to me.
Absolutely, sure. I mean, that's a milestone. Of course, that rhetoric goes back to earlier in the 19th century with the anti-slavery movement and the sort of defense of slavery and the attempt to sort of say, well, you can have, slavery can stay as long as we impose proper regulations, right? They're not comparable morally, but it's the same sort of rhetoric and thinking where the claim is by the master, this is property, the state has no business telling me what to do, right? As I said, the same argument applies to women and children, who are considered fundamentally to be property in the 19th century.
That's interesting. Tell me about Henry Bergh's fight with Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt, he's one of the titans of industry here in New York.
Sure. Well, I mean, obviously that he was one of the people who ran one of these horse trolley lines, and so Bergh finds that Vanderbilt's horses are being, he finds one of them collapsed in the gutter, abandoned by his driver on an icy night, and he revives it, takes it back to Vanderbilt's stable, and denounces Vanderbilt privately, thinking, we're part of the same class. You must not mean this to be happening in your name. And Vanderbilt sort of brushes him off, says, "Oh yeah, we love horses," and ignores the problem. And so Bergh has to continually escalate this, eventually making it public, denouncing Vanderbilt and the other keepers of these lines. So yeah, that's another place where, he was often criticized because he was targeting, this is a time of when there's a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment. Bergh certainly felt that way. He felt the Irish were the worst when it came to treating their animals and their families. So he was accused of being basically biased against them, and he always would insist the wealthy are just as capable of cruelty as the poor, right? And yes, I'm going after the poor, but I'm going after the rich as well. And Vanderbilt's a case in point for him.
How would that end?
Bergh ended up stopping these trolleys in the middle of rush hour, demanding that the horses be taken back to the barn, and that often the teamster would fight back. And if Bergh got too much of an argument, he was a big, tall guy, and he was known to sort of grab these people by the lapel and throw them in the gutter.
Is he doing this by himself?
Sometimes he had agents with him, but other times it would just be him. It's kind of this avenging angel out there in the streets of New York. And just stopping them would cause such huge traffic jams. The entire city would back up along the, whatever avenue that these trolley lines came. They were coming along every 10 minutes. And so disrupting a trolley for a couple hours would essentially shut down the entire line. So Bergh didn't always have to win in court. He could just essentially harass the horse trolley lines. Eventually, Bergh won enough of these that the trolley lines began to say, yeah, okay, this is probably, we can accept this because he's out there keeping an eye on our employees and making sure they're not abusing our horses. So they developed, but it took a decade before they kind of got resolved.
Let's talk about how this movement spread. And there's a major component of this, and it's a newspaper called Our Dumb Animal.
Yeah. I think another piece, Bergh was very much a believer in punishing the cruel. That cruel men, and it was mostly men, were never going to change except by threat of imprisonment, a fine. He even thought it would be a good idea to whip wife beaters and child beaters, in the streets. which horrified a lot of his supporters. But there was another piece of this movement, and it was largely centered in Boston. George Angell was the founder of the Massachusetts SPCA, just right around the same time. Bergh was first, but clearly this movement was in the air, right? And Angell was much more interested in what came to be called humane education, which was, we may not be able to change the hearts and minds of, Teamsters, but if we can get at Teamsters' children, if we can, reach children to get them to love animals, to be kind to animals, with the right kind of literature, with the right kind of ceremonies, that kind of thing, we can change the world. I mean, they were very optimistic that you raise a generation of kind children and a lot of the world's problems are going to disappear. And so he founded this magazine, Our Dumb Animals, which was really kind of a compendium of stories about, kind treatment to animals and the dog that rescues its master and, the latest news from the SPCA movement. And he had these distributed by the thousands, first around Massachusetts and then all around the country. They also published lots of pamphlets, and George Angell was most proud of bringing the British novel Black Beauty to the United States, which he called the Uncle Tom's Cabin of the Horse. As a sort of great testament to horse suffering and the value of kind treatment, which of course, I think is really one of the obvious legacies that continues with us today. I certainly still talk to people who grew up loving that novel.
You write about the campaign for human kindness. Is this what they called it? A campaign for human kindness? Was this a movement that's actually what they called it?
Yeah. And they actually, this was there were, lots of women were involved in this. They were not ever the agents in the street trying to wrestle Teamsters to the ground. Instead, they considered their avenue in this reform was to raise money and to reach children to be part of this education. So they formed what they called Band of Mercy clubs, where they would invite children to come. They would create a clubhouse. They would give them literature. They would give them badges and ceremonies. And these children would take a pledge to, I promise that I will not only not be cruel, but I will be brave enough to intervene when I see somebody treating an animal cruelly. So this was a really crucial piece of the movement. It was also very important in Philadelphia, where the women's branch of the SPCA in Philadelphia was very active in promoting this kind of Band of Mercy activity.
Again, this movement really gets going and comes to prominence just the years after the Civil War, after slavery had come to an end. Are there people objecting to using some of the same language and just narratives comparing it to slavery, and including maybe former slaves or even Black Americans with that comparison?
No, I did not see that. I certainly looked for it. I think it's interesting. I don't think that the movement was guilty of making a moral comparison between the two institutions in that way. I mean, the rhetoric of suffering, of that the animals are, Bergh would often call them our suffering slaves. That rhetoric was there, and it was powerful, obviously, rhetorically, and even more powerful then than it would be for us now. But they never crossed that line and considered animals to be equivalent to human beings in any way. On the flip side, people who were critical of the movement said, this is the kind of crazy reform talk that the abolitionists were promoting. What next? You're looking out for the rights of animals. You're already looking out for the rights of freed people. Now you're bringing it to animals. This is just another sort of crazy Northeastern radicalism that's going to get us in trouble.
Right, because that's where the radicals came from at the time, where the Northeast were radical Republicans.
That's right.
You keep mentioning Teamsters, these workers of the horse or the trolley cars, and every time you say Teamsters, I think of the union, and I'm just thinking maybe other people are thinking that too. What originally were Teamsters?
They're people who were hired to work teams of horses, a skilled job, you had to know what you're doing, especially navigating in an urban environment with 2 or 3 horses towing a big wagon, delivery wagons, that sort of thing. They were teamsters.
There's another fight I want to ask you about, and it didn't necessarily end in a fight, but it seemed to start off that way between Bergh, and that would be P.T. Barnum. Tell me who P.T. Barnum was.
Yeah, of course, Barnum was the great impresario who really more than anybody else brought the world's animals to the United States. And he did this through circuses. He did it through traveling menageries. And most famously at the time, he did this in his American Museum, which was a 3 or 4 story wooden building on Broadway in New York that he crammed with whales and manatees and giant snake collections. He even had a giraffe there that he had to cut a hole in one of the floors so that the giraffe's head could stick through. Really just incredibly fascinating to a world. We live, I think, in a time when we take for granted both sophisticated zoos and also nature documentaries, but just imagine what that felt like in the 19th century when really for the first time, an orangutan shows up on American shores and people can see this. So Barnum, he also sold all kinds of frauds and all kinds of fascinating, weird gimmicks. And he brought in, great singers, and he was always looking for whatever would draw an audience. But animals were a big part of his appeal. And of course, that put him on a collision course with Bergh, because, Bergh was always considering that this, what's happening to these animals that are here. And especially when Barnum's museum burned down, which happened 3 times, with complete loss of all these animals. And for Barnum, that was not to suggest he didn't care about the animals, but really he was a businessman and he could always just go buy some more on the world market, which he did. He'd always say, well, sorry to have lost those, but I'm going to go get twice as many. The public's going to love it. So Bergh was constantly pushing against this and trying to, he was, way ahead of his time in his fights with Barnum over elephant training, where Barnum said, basically a certain amount of violence is a necessary part of training an elephant. They have to be in submission. This is how it's done. And Bergh's response was, well, if that's what it takes, then we should not be doing it, right? We should, and for Barnum's argument was this is educational. The public comes to care more about nature and God's world and all that sort of thing if they come to the zoo and they see this. But for Bergh, it was just cheap sensation at the expense of animal suffering. So, at a time when the Central Park Zoo was one of the most popular attractions in the city, Bergh was advocating we should either humanely kill all those animals or we should send them back where they came from. We should not be exploiting them in this way. So there was a rivalry between the two going on for years, but it was a friendly rivalry because they both came out of the same class. They both had some similar sort of flamboyant talents for publicity. I think they both benefited. When Bergh went after Barnum about an event, Barnum would turn it into a big production and get more publicity out of it. Whereas Bergh himself and the SPCA would also get publicity from their battles with Barnum. So they had a sort of reciprocal relationship, such that when Bergh died in the 1880s, Barnum came to his funeral and said, well, Bergh was a little bit crazy on the subject, but at the same time, he admired him. And actually, when Barnum died, he donated $1,000 in his will to erect a fountain in honor of Bergh in his hometown of Bridgeport, Connecticut.
Fountains were a thing with the SPCA.
Yeah, they were not just worried about, the animal cruelty right in the streets, the whipping and that sort of thing, clubbing horses to keep them moving, but they were also interested in improving the infrastructure of the city so that the horses would not suffer. So part of that was improving the pavement. Thousands of horses, in these cities would break their legs by slipping because there really was no clear, good idea about pavement. Cobblestones were terrible for horses. Wood planks were slippery. They tried a lot of things, and so this was an issue that the humane movement took up and tried to fix. And another area was watering troughs, and that they're all over. I think a lot of them are gone now. Many of them are dried up. Most of them, I'm sure, are dried up, but they're all over the country. That were money would be raised. Somebody would be the donor who would get credit for this, and it'd be a ceremony. And there would be also troughs usually for horses, sometimes troughs down low for dogs as well, and there would be a tin cup so that humans could also have a drink, which was in retrospect probably a very terrible idea for spreading disease. But it was a big, that the movement actually had an ally in the temperance movement, and so they would get together on these fountains because give a man a cold drink of water on it, and he might not go to the saloon, was the idea. So they're beautiful structures, and some of them I guess were either too heavy or too interesting to take out when the horses left.
Well, and thank you for refraining from bringing up the photos. I sent you over the weekend before our conversation, because as I was preparing for our conversation and learning about these fountains, I remembered that there is a fountain just a 15-minute walk from where I live in downtown Oakland, over what we call Latham Square. I sent you some photos of this fountain. It had 4 troughs for horses to drink from. It was erected a little bit later than the time of period you're talking about in 1913, but it was really, I never put that together. I mean, that I've known of that fountain for 20 years, and
it's an incredible piece of work. I've seen a lot of these, and I've never seen one quite so elaborate and beautiful. So it's definitely worth a walk for people who are in the neighborhood.
Yeah, for folks who are in the Bay Area, you just go to the Latham Square, where Telegraph and Broadway meets in downtown Oakland, and it's there. And really, yeah, it's in good shape. It's got some spray paint over it. Otherwise, it's in pretty good shape.
Yeah.
So Bergh dies in 1888. Anything significant about his death?
Well, I think what's important is that by the time he died, almost every state had taken his law and adopted it for their own. Variations of Bergh's law basically go across the country. And I mentioned George Angell in Boston and the women in Philadelphia who were so important in building the first dog shelter. But what really I think is important about Bergh's legacy is that even though he was the sort of the highest lightning rod of the movement and the person everybody thought of when they thought about animal lovers of the 19th century, it was really a mass movement. It was hundreds and thousands of women and men across the country who realized this was this had to change, and it was possible to change it, and organizing, to create the institution that's still with us today. I mean, it's so easy for us to take for granted that sort of animal control, is a part of a civilized civic society. But we need to remember who started it and how controversial it was at the time.
Do you see links to today's movements, even some of the more extreme movements?
Well, I think they all trace back to Bergh and his movement, because Bergh started making that claim that there was such a thing as animal rights. At the same time, the split between animal liberation, for example, and animal welfare is a real one. That animal liberation is influenced, Bergh's spark is there, but it also is clearly influenced by liberation movements of the 60s and 70s. The environmental movement is also, something which, worked in parallel with the animal welfare movement, but really they have different sort of focus. So I think Bergh would be both surprised and impressed that his own institution has done so well for so long. I think he'd be really impressed by the fact that the sort of no-kill shelter is now the model people are striving for, rather than humane euthanizing of animals wherever that's possible. That would be a huge accomplishment and something they never figured out in his day. And I think he would be stunned and impressed by all the branches that have, gone far more radical ways. Bergh spent his whole life being accused of being a radical, uh, but the movement now is way ahead of whatever he thought was possible in terms of being aware, while recognizing all the limitations, all the ways that the problems he saw back then are still with us in some different form.
And just finally, thinking about cities today, clearly the hygiene is better than you would have found in the 19th century. Sure. When the cities were full of animals. Today there are animals, but they're mostly pigeons, maybe some rats, birds. If you're lucky, if you have a big enough park, you'll get some birds.
Yeah.
But it seems like did you think we've lost something for not having that kind of a connection to animals the way we used to?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I was struck by the fact that at the same time that this is happening, that animals become problematic in the city, this is also the rise of modern consumer pet culture. The Westminster Kennel Club first show is 1877, I think it is, and it's right, so it's right in the middle of this movement, and the kind of fascination with purebred breeds and pet shops. And so I think there's a compensatory quality to this, right? That, as animals, as we move from a rural to an urban environment, as we change the nature of an urban environment, we love and lavish attention on our pets more than anybody in the 19th century would have thought wise or possible, right? Or sane. And I think, maybe that's sort of an expression of that need for that kind of connection. I think also, the just beginning at that time and flourishing now is the conservation movement and interesting people, getting out in the world and connecting to nature. That's evolved a lot since the 1870s when Bergh was involved. A lot of that really started with hunters and sportsmen's clubs rather than environmentalists as such. So that all has evolved in those years, and I think there's a compensation there for us.
Just so interesting how the world started to change in this period of time that you're writing about.
It really did. Yeah, I really think, this is why I keep going back to thinking about this time period, because I think so many of the things we've inherited that we think of as modern really start to emerge in embryo. And, you can sort of go back and see them struggling with creating the things that the technology, the ideas about race and ethnicity, ideas about free speech, ideas about disability. It just goes on and on and on. And all of these things are bubbling up at this point. And the moral questions are being raised then that look very familiar to us today.
Ernest Freeberg has been our guest. Ernest Freeberg is a distinguished professor of humanities at the University of Tennessee, and he is the author of the book, A Traitor to His Species, Henry Bergh and the Birth of the Animal Rights Movement. Ernest Freeberg, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I do thank you.
I have too. Thank you, Mitch.